Ambassador Sarah Chen walked through the crystalline corridors of the Galactic Council station, her footsteps echoing against the translucent walls that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns. The other species had built this place to be beautiful, she thought, but also cold. Everything here was designed to impress, to intimidate, to remind visitors that they were guests in a vast universe where humanity was still considered the newcomer. The Zephyrian delegation passed her in the hallway, their tall, reed-like bodies swaying gracefully as they moved. Their leader, Ambassador Veltar, nodded politely at Sarah, but she caught the slight tremor in his secondary arms, a sign of nervousness among his people. Word traveled fast in the station, and everyone knew why the emergency session had been called. Sarah had been a diplomat for 15 years, ever since humanity had achieved faster-than-light travel and stumbled into the galactic community. She remembered those early days when humans were seen as primitive warmongers, barely worthy of a seat at the council table. That perception had changed over the years, but perhaps not in the way anyone had expected. The council chamber was a massive sphere, with seating arranged in concentric circles that could accommodate the diverse physiologies of 47 different species. Gravity fields adjusted automatically as delegates took their seats, ensuring comfort for beings who had evolved under wildly different conditions. The Krillian representatives hung upside down from specialized perches, while the aquatic tidal lords remained in their environmental suits, filled with their homeworld's methane-rich atmosphere. Sarah took her place in the human section, a modest cluster of seats that seemed almost insignificant compared to the sprawling delegations of the older galactic powers. Beside her sat Ambassador James Rodriguez, her colleague and friend who specialized in trade negotiations. His dark eyes held the same concern she felt. They both knew this wasn't going to be a routine session. The chamber fell silent as Chancellor Mordex of the Hegemony rose from the central dais. His species, the Vorthak, were among the founding members of the Galactic Council, and their word carried enormous weight. Mordex's 4 arms spread wide in a gesture of formal address, his chitinous exoskeleton gleaming under the chamber's artificial starlight. "Fellow beings of the galaxy," Mordex began, his voice translated simultaneously into dozens of languages through neural implants. "We gather today to address a matter of grave concern that threatens the very fabric of our peaceful coexistence." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. She had a good idea where this was heading, but she hoped she was wrong. "Over the past 5 standard years," the Chancellor continued, "we have witnessed an unprecedented number of conflicts, territorial disputes, and economic disruptions. Our investigation has revealed a disturbing pattern. In every single case, human diplomats were involved in the negotiations preceding these incidents." A murmur rippled through the chamber. Sarah noticed how many delegates were now looking directly at the human section, some with curiosity, others with something that looked suspiciously like fear. Ambassador Telvash of the Crystalline Collective stood up, her geometric form catching and refracting light as she moved. "I must corroborate the Chancellor's findings," she said, her voice like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. 3 months ago, Ambassador Chen herself mediated our dispute with the Mining Guild over asteroid rights in the Vega system. Sarah remembered the case well. It had been a complex situation involving overlapping territorial claims and environmental concerns. The human negotiator, Telvash continued, convinced both parties to examine not just the immediate benefits of mining operations, but the long-term consequences for future generations. She asked us to consider what kind of legacy we wanted to leave for our offspring. The crystalline delegate's form flickered with what Sarah had learned to recognize as emotional distress. Her words forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about our motivations. The collective had to acknowledge that our desire for rare minerals was driven more by greed than necessity. The Mining Guild faced similar revelations about their exploitation of worker species. Chancellor Mordex nodded gravely. And what was the result of this mediation? Both parties withdrew their claims entirely, Telvash admitted. The asteroid field remains untouched, and both the Collective and the Guild have since restructured their operations based on ethical considerations rather than pure profit. Our entire economic model has been disrupted. Similar testimonies followed from other delegates. The Aquarian Syndicate described how human mediators had helped them resolve a generations-old blood feud by forcing both sides to truly listen to each other's pain. The conflict ended, but it left both factions emotionally devastated as they confronted the futility of their hatred. The Nexus traders spoke of a trade dispute where human diplomats had exposed the underlying exploitation in their supply chains, leading to a complete restructuring of galactic commerce that, while more ethical, was significantly less profitable for the established powers. Each testimony painted the same picture. Human diplomats solved problems, ended conflicts, and brought peace. But they did so by forcing all parties to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves, their motivations, and their actions. Ambassador Rodriguez leaned over to whisper to Sarah. They're making it sound like we're some kind of psychological warfare specialists. Sarah whispered back, Maybe we are, and we just never realized it. The final testimony came from General Cax Thul of the Warforge Empire, a militant species known for their straightforward approach to conflict resolution. His massive, armored form dominated his section of the chamber, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. 6 months ago, he began, the Empire was on the brink of war with the Pacifica Alliance over colonial expansion rights. Both sides had mobilized fleets, and bloodshed seemed inevitable. The Council sent human mediator Ambassador Rachel Park to negotiate a peaceful resolution. Sarah knew Rachel well. She was one of the best negotiators in the human diplomatic corps, known for her ability to find common ground in the most impossible situations. Ambassador Park asked each side a simple question. General Caxthul continued, his voice heavy with something Sarah couldn't quite identify. She asked us what we hoped to accomplish through war that we couldn't achieve through cooperation. She forced us to articulate our goals, our fears, and our deepest motivations. The general's armored plates shifted, a sign of discomfort in his species. Under her questioning, both the Empire and the Alliance had to admit that our posturing was not about territory or resources. It was about pride, about proving ourselves worthy of respect in the galactic community. We were prepared to sacrifice thousands of lives for the sake of our egos. A profound silence settled over the chamber. This was clearly a difficult admission for the proud Warforged leader. The war was averted, General Cax Thul concluded, but at a cost none of us anticipated. My people now question the very foundations of our warrior culture. The Alliance has been forced to examine their own moral superiority complex. Both civilizations are in the midst of identity crises that may take generations to resolve. Chancellor Mordex stood again, his expression grave. And therein lies the problem. Human diplomats do not simply negotiate agreements. They perform what can only be described as psychological surgery on entire civilizations. They cut away our comfortable lies and force us to confront truths we would rather ignore. Sarah felt compelled to respond. She stood slowly, aware that every eye in the chamber was now focused on her. Chancellor, if I may address the Council? Mordex nodded. The floor recognizes Ambassador Chen. Honorable delegates, Sarah began, her voice steady despite the tension she felt. I believe there may be a misunderstanding about our methods. Humans don't set out to cause psychological distress or disrupt civilizations. We simply ask questions that we believe are relevant to finding lasting solutions. She paused, looking around the chamber at the diverse array of beings who represented the galaxy's most powerful civilizations. In our experience, conflicts that are resolved without addressing their root causes tend to resurface. We ask difficult questions because easy answers rarely lead to lasting peace. Ambassador Quilteth of the scholarly reaches, a species known for their intellectual pursuits, spoke up. But Ambassador Chen, surely you must realize the impact of your methods. The psychological trauma your negotiations inflict goes far beyond the immediate parties involved. Sarah frowned. Trauma? I'm not sure I understand. Allow me to explain, Quilteth said, their multiple eyes focusing on Sarah with unsettling intensity. 3 years ago, you mediated a dispute between our research institutions and the Conservation Corps over the study of sentient crystal formations on Kepler 442b. Sarah remembered the case. It had involved questions about the rights of potentially sentient geological formations and the ethics of scientific observation. During the negotiations, Quilteth continued, you asked us to consider whether our pursuit of knowledge gave us the right to study beings without their consent, even if those beings communicated in ways we couldn't understand. You forced us to confront the possibility that our entire scientific method was built on a foundation of intellectual colonialism. The scholar's form seemed to deflate slightly. The revelation has paralyzed our research community. We can no longer pursue knowledge with the same confidence we once had. Every experiment now comes with existential questions about consent, harm, and the right to know. Our advancement in the sciences has slowed dramatically. Sarah felt a growing sense of unease. But surely questioning our methods and motivations leads to better, more ethical outcomes? Perhaps, Quilteth admitted, but at what cost? Your questions don't just solve immediate problems. They unravel the very foundations of how we think about ourselves and our place in the universe. It's overwhelming. Ambassador Tevarash of the Emotion Feeders, a species that literally consumed emotional energy, stood up. Their translucent form pulsed with agitated colors as they spoke. The humans have poisoned the emotional atmosphere of the entire galaxy, they declared. Where once we fed on simple, clean emotions, anger, joy, fear, love, now everything is contaminated with doubt, self-reflection, and existential anxiety. The very food we need to survive has become bitter and complex. This revelation shocked Sarah. She had never considered that their diplomatic methods might have such far-reaching consequences beyond the immediate parties involved in negotiations. Chancellor Mordex raised his hands for silence. The evidence is clear. Human diplomatic methods, while effective at ending immediate conflicts, create psychological and social disruption that spreads far beyond the original disputes. Entire civilizations have been forced to question their fundamental beliefs and values. He paused, letting his words sink in. Therefore, this council must make a difficult decision. We recognize humanity's valuable contributions to galactic peace, but we cannot ignore the unintended consequences of their methods. Sarah's heart began to race. She could see where this was heading, but she couldn't believe the council would take such a drastic step. Effective immediately, Chancellor Mordex announced, human beings are banned from serving as mediators, negotiators, or diplomatic representatives in any capacity within Galactic Council jurisdiction. The chamber erupted in a mixture of approval and protest. Some delegates seemed relieved, while others appeared shocked by the severity of the ruling. Furthermore, the Chancellor continued, raising his voice to be heard over the commotion, any ongoing negotiations involving human diplomats must be immediately suspended and transferred to alternative mediators. Sarah stood up, her voice cutting through the noise. Chancellor, this is unprecedented. Humanity has done nothing but serve the cause of peace. That is precisely the problem, Ambassador Chen, Mordex replied sadly. Your peace cuts too deep. Your words heal wounds we didn't even know we had, but they also create new ones in the process. As the session concluded and delegates began filing out of the chamber, Sarah remained in her seat, stunned by what had just occurred. Rodriguez put a hand on her shoulder, but neither of them spoke. The galaxy had just declared human diplomacy too dangerous to be allowed, not because they were bad at it, but because they were too good. They had achieved something unprecedented in galactic history. They had been banned not for their failures, but for their successes. As Sarah finally stood to leave, she wondered what this meant for humanity's future in the galactic community. More importantly, she wondered what it meant for a galaxy that had just chosen comfortable lies over difficult truths. The crystalline corridors seemed even colder as she walked back to her quarters, the weight of the Council's decision settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. Humanity had always prided itself on asking the hard questions, on seeking truth even when it was uncomfortable. Now, for the first time in their short galactic history, they were being told that some truths were too dangerous to pursue. 6 months had passed since the infamous Council ruling, and the galaxy was beginning to show the strain. Ambassador Sarah Chen reviewed the latest reports from her temporary office on Luna Station, humanity's primary diplomatic outpost, now relegated to observer status in galactic affairs. The numbers painted a troubling picture. Without human mediators, the galaxy had reverted to older, more traditional methods of conflict resolution. The Arbitration Corps, an ancient institution that relied on rigid legal frameworks and precedent-based decisions, had been given expanded authority to handle disputes. Their approach was methodical, predictable, and completely unable to address the underlying causes of most conflicts. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the human psychologist who had been studying the aftermath of the diplomatic ban, knocked on Sarah's door. Her research had become invaluable in understanding what was happening across the galaxy, though the findings were deeply disturbing. "The latest analysis is ready," Elena said, settling into a chair across from Sarah's desk. Her normally composed demeanor showed signs of strain, dark circles under her eyes, and a tension in her shoulders that spoke of long nights wrestling with difficult data. "How bad is it?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Elena opened her tablet and scrolled through several charts. 3 major wars have broken out in the past 2 months alone. The Crystalline Collective and the Mining Guild are back to their territorial dispute, but this time, they're shooting instead of talking. The Aquarian blood feud has reignited with a vengeance, and the Nexus traders have established what can only be described as a slave trade in the Outer Rim territories. Sarah felt sick. These were all conflicts that human diplomats had previously resolved, but without addressing the root causes, they had simply gone dormant, waiting for the right trigger to explode back into violence. "But here's the really disturbing part," Elena continued, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "The psychological profiles of the species involved show that they're aware of what they're doing. They know their actions are wrong. They remember the insights they gained during human-mediated negotiations, but they're choosing to ignore those revelations." "They're choosing ignorance?" Sarah couldn't hide her disbelief. "Not exactly," Elena said, pulling up a detailed analysis. "It's more complex than that. They're experiencing what we might call cognitive dissonance resolution through behavioral regression. They can't unlearn what they discovered about themselves during human negotiations, but they also can't live comfortably with those truths. So they're acting in direct opposition to their own moral insights as a way of rejecting the discomfort those insights create." Sarah stared out the viewport at the stars beyond, trying to process what she was hearing. "So they're essentially having collective nervous breakdowns?" "In a sense, yes. The Warforge Empire is the most dramatic example. General Caxthul's people are engaged in the most brutal military campaign in their history, specifically because they know their warrior culture is built on lies. They're trying to prove their original beliefs were correct by embracing them more extremely than ever before. The irony was almost too much to bear. Human diplomacy had been banned because it forced species to confront uncomfortable truths, but without that process of honest self-examination, the galaxy was tearing itself apart. Elena pulled up another report. The emotion feeders are suffering the worst psychological collapse. Remember how they complained that human diplomacy had made emotions too complex? Well, now they're deliberately seeking out simple, pure emotional states by engineering conflicts and tragedies. They're literally addicted to the clean emotional highs they get from manufactured suffering. A soft chime indicated an incoming message. Sarah glanced at her terminal and saw it was from Ambassador Rodriguez, who was currently stationed on Earth, working with the UN Security Council to monitor the galactic situation. "Elena, you need to see this," Sarah said, activating the hologram projector. James Rodriguez appeared as a three-dimensional image, his usually cheerful demeanor replaced by grim concern. "Sarah, we've just received a priority communication from the scholarly reaches. Ambassador Quilteth wants to meet with you privately. Apparently, the situation in their sector has become critical." "Critical how?" Sarah asked. "Their research paralysis has spread beyond the scientific community," Rodriguez explained. "The entire civilization has essentially stopped functioning. They can't make any significant decisions because every choice leads them back to the fundamental questions you raised about knowledge, consent, and the right to act. They're literally thinking themselves to death." Elena shook her head sadly. "It's what I was afraid would happen. Some species are better equipped to handle existential uncertainty than others. Humans evolved in an environment where questioning assumptions was a survival advantage, but for species that evolved in more stable environments, uncertainty can be paralyzing." "There's more," Rodriguez continued. "We're getting similar requests from other species. The Pacifica Alliance wants human mediation for their internal civil war. The Hegemony Council is dealing with a succession crisis that's threatening to split their empire. Even the Galactic Council itself is facing a legitimacy crisis. Half the member species are talking about withdrawing entirely." Sarah stood up and began pacing. "So let me understand this. The Council banned human diplomats because our methods were too disruptive, but without those methods, the galaxy is experiencing even more disruption?" "Exactly," Rodriguez confirmed. "And here's the kicker. Chancellor Mordex has been quietly reaching out through back channels to see if humanity would be willing to provide unofficial consultation on some of the more serious conflicts." Elena laughed bitterly. "They want the benefits of human diplomatic insight without having to officially acknowledge that they need us." A new voice interrupted their conversation. "Actually, they want something much more specific than that." Sarah turned to see Ambassador Rachel Park standing in the doorway. Rachel was the mediator whose work with the Warforge Empire and Pacifica Alliance had been mentioned during the council session. She looked exhausted but determined. "Rachel!" Sarah exclaimed. "I thought you were on sabbatical." "I was," Rachel replied, entering the room, "until I started getting secret communications from delegates across the galaxy. They don't just want informal consultation, Sarah. They want something that's never been attempted before." She activated her own datapad and shared a file with the room. "I've been working with a coalition of moderate delegates from 12 different species. They believe the galaxy needs what they're calling therapeutic diplomacy, a systematic program to help entire civilizations process the psychological disruption caused by forced self-examination." Elena leaned forward, intrigued. "You mean like psychological counseling, but on a species-wide scale?" "Something like that," Rachel confirmed. "The theory is that human diplomatic methods are actually a form of collective therapy. We force civilizations to confront their unconscious motivations and hidden traumas, but then we leave them to process those revelations on their own. No wonder they're having breakdowns." Sarah was beginning to see the implications. So you're suggesting we need to follow up on our diplomatic interventions with ongoing psychological support? More than that, Rachel said, her excitement growing. I think we need to fundamentally rethink what diplomacy means. Traditional galactic diplomacy treats symptoms, territorial disputes, trade disagreements, succession conflicts. Human diplomacy identifies underlying causes but doesn't provide tools for healing. But how do you provide therapy to an entire civilization? Elena asked. The logistical challenges alone would be overwhelming. Rachel smiled for the first time since entering the room. That's where it gets interesting. Remember how the emotion feeders complained that human diplomacy had contaminated the emotional atmosphere? Well, what if that's actually a feature, not a bug? She pulled up a complex diagram showing emotional and psychological networks across galactic civilization. Human diplomatic methods don't just affect the immediate parties in a negotiation. They create ripple effects that spread through entire populations. If we could learn to control and direct those ripples, we could provide healing on the same scale that we currently provide disruption. Sarah stared at the diagram, beginning to understand the magnitude of what Rachel was proposing. You're talking about engineering psychological evolution across multiple species simultaneously. I'm talking about guided psychological evolution, Rachel corrected. The difference is consent and support. Instead of forcing civilizations to confront difficult truths and then abandoning them to figure out the consequences on their own, we would provide ongoing guidance through the transformation process. Elena was frantically taking notes. This could revolutionize our understanding of both diplomacy and psychology, but the ethical implications are staggering. We would essentially be reshaping the fundamental nature of galactic civilization. The fundamental nature of galactic civilization is already being reshaped, Rodriguez pointed out from his hologram. The question is whether it happens through destructive chaos or constructive guidance. A priority alert chimed on Sarah's terminal. She glanced at the message and felt her stomach drop. We may not have time for theoretical discussions, she said grimly. Chancellor Mordex is requesting an immediate emergency consultation. The Galactic Council is facing complete collapse. Rachel checked her own messages and nodded. I'm getting similar requests from our secret coalition. The moderate delegates are ready to move forward with the therapeutic diplomacy proposal, but they need human involvement to make it work. What exactly are they proposing? Sarah asked. A pilot program, Rachel explained. They want to select one major ongoing conflict and allow human diplomats to attempt a therapeutic resolution approach. If it works, they'll consider lifting the ban on human diplomacy and officially adopting the new methodology. Elena looked up from her notes. And if it doesn't work? Then humanity gets permanently expelled from the Galactic Council, and we become a quarantine species, Rodriguez said soberly. The moderate delegates are taking a huge political risk by even suggesting this. Sarah felt the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders. Humanity was being offered a chance to not just return to galactic diplomacy, but to fundamentally transform it. The potential benefits were enormous, but so were the risks. What conflict are they suggesting for the pilot program? She asked. Rachel's expression grew grave. The coalition wars in the Andromeda Spiral. 17 different species locked in a multi-dimensional conflict that's been raging for 3 years. Traditional mediation has failed completely, and the war is spreading to neighboring systems. Sarah knew about the coalition wars. They were considered the most complex and intractable conflict in recent galactic history. Multiple overlapping territorial disputes. Ethnic hatred spanning millennia, economic exploitation, religious conflicts, and competing claims to technological artifacts left by an extinct civilization. That's not a pilot program, Elena said quietly. That's a trial by fire. It's also our only chance, Rachel replied. The moderate delegates chose the coalition wars specifically because they're so complex. If therapeutic diplomacy can work there, it can work anywhere. Sarah looked around the room at her colleagues. then at the star field beyond her viewport. Somewhere out there, 17 different civilizations were destroying each other, trapped in cycles of violence and hatred that traditional diplomacy couldn't break. "How long do we have to decide?" she asked. "The council meets in 72 hours, Rodriguez replied. "If we're going to do this, we need to be ready to present a complete therapeutic diplomacy framework including specific methodologies and a detailed intervention plan." Rachel stood up. "I've already been working on the framework with the coalition delegates. We have the theoretical foundation, but we need to decide on the specific approach for the coalition wars." Elena closed her tablet and stood as well. "I can have a psychological assessment of all 17 species ready in 24 hours, including recommendations for therapeutic intervention strategies." Sarah took one last look at the stars, knowing that whatever decision she made in the next few days would determine not just humanity's future in the galaxy, but potentially the future of galactic civilization itself. "All right," she said finally. "Let's save the galaxy." The council outlawed human diplomats after realizing their words hurt deeper than knives. The coalition war zone hung before them like a festering wound in space. From the observation deck of the diplomatic vessel, Harmony, Sarah Chen watched the flashing lights of distant battles illuminating the nebulae around them. 17 different fleets moved through the Andromeda spiral in complex patterns of attack and retreat, each convinced that their cause was just, their enemies evil, and their victory essential for the survival of their civilization. 3 weeks had passed since the emergency council session, where humanity had been given permission to attempt their therapeutic diplomacy approach. The framework they had developed was ambitious beyond anything previously attempted in galactic history. Instead of simply mediating between opposing sides, they would guide all 17 species through a collective process of psychological healing and transformation. Dr. Elena Vasquez stood beside Sarah at the viewport, her portable analysis station displaying real-time psychological profiles of the warring factions. "The preliminary scans are disturbing," she said quietly. "These species aren't just fighting over territory or resources anymore. They're addicted to the conflict itself." Ambassador Rachel Park looked up from her preparation materials. "Elaborate on that." "Each species has developed what we might call warrior identity syndrome," Elena explained, pulling up detailed psychological maps. "Their sense of self has become so intertwined with being at war that they literally don't know who they are without an enemy to fight. Peace has become existentially threatening to them." Ambassador Rodriguez, who had arrived from Earth just hours before, shook his head. "So we're not just dealing with a political conflict, we're dealing with mass psychological dependency on violence. It's worse than that," Elena continued, highlighting specific data points. "The Thraxian Empire, for example, has restructured their entire society around the war economy. Their birth rate, education system, technological development, even their art and literature, everything is focused on producing better warriors. If the war ends, their civilization will face total collapse." Sarah studied the data with growing concern. "And I assume the other species have similar dependencies?" "Each one has developed its own form of war addiction," Elena confirmed. "The Void Seekers have turned their conflict into a religious crusade. They believe their enemies are literally demons sent to test their faith. The Crystal Hives have convinced themselves that victory in this war will unlock the secrets of the ancient artifacts they're fighting over, giving them godlike powers." Rachel pulled up her own analysis. "This is exactly what our therapeutic diplomacy model was designed to address. We can't just negotiate a ceasefire. We need to help these species find new sources of meaning and identity that don't depend on violence." A soft chime indicated an incoming message. The hologram of Chancellor Mordex appeared in the center of the room. His 4 arms spread in a gesture of formal greeting, but his posture showed clear signs of stress. "Ambassador Chen," he began, I trust your preparation is proceeding according to schedule? We're ready to begin, Chancellor, Sarah replied. But I want to be clear about what we're attempting here. This isn't traditional mediation. We'll be asking all 17 species to undergo fundamental psychological transformations simultaneously. Mordex's chitinous plates shifted nervously. The Council is aware of the unprecedented nature of your approach. Many delegates are skeptical. Skeptical enough to interfere with the process? Rodriguez asked pointedly. Some council members believe that the coalition wars serve as a useful outlet for galactic aggression, Mordex admitted reluctantly. They prefer contained warfare to the psychological disruption that human diplomacy tends to cause. Sarah felt a chill of understanding. Are you telling us that some council members want the war to continue? I'm telling you that if your therapeutic diplomacy approach fails, there will be significant political pressure to not only maintain the ban on human diplomats, but to completely isolate humanity from galactic affairs, Mordex said gravely. Your species' future in the galaxy depends on the success of this mission. The Chancellor's image faded, leaving the human team alone with the weight of their responsibility. Elena stared at her data displays. Rodriguez began reviewing their intervention protocols, and Rachel double-checked their communication equipment. Sarah activated the ship's intercom. All teams, prepare for deployment. We're about to attempt something that's never been done before in galactic history. The next phase of their plan required splitting up. Each human diplomat would work with specific species groupings, but they would remain in constant communication to coordinate the psychological intervention. The goal was to guide all 17 species through parallel processes of self-examination and transformation, helping them discover new sources of identity and meaning that didn't require enemies to fight. Sarah's assignment was the most challenging. She would work directly with the three most militaristic species, the Thraxian Empire, the Iron Brotherhood, and the Savage Clans. These were the factions whose entire cultures had become most dependent on warfare. The meeting was held on neutral ground, an ancient space station that predated the current conflict. The station's original builders were long extinct, but their architecture created an atmosphere of timeless solemnity that seemed appropriate for what they were attempting. General Korthax of the Thraxian Empire was the first to arrive. His massive, heavily scarred form dominated the conference room, and his eyes held the cold calculation of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of warfare. Behind him came his staff, younger officers whose entire lives had been shaped by this endless conflict. War Chief Bannon of the Iron Brotherhood entered next, his cybernetic enhancements whirring softly as he moved. His people had replaced much of their organic tissue with mechanical components, believing that flesh was weakness and only metal could achieve true strength. The Savage Clans were represented by Huntress Vexara, whose people had rejected technology in favor of biological enhancement. Her predatory features and obvious physical modifications spoke of a species that had literally evolved themselves into living weapons. Sarah stood at the head of the conference table, acutely aware that she was facing three of the most dangerous military leaders in the galaxy. Any one of them could have her killed with a gesture, and all of them had spent years viewing humanity as weak and inferior. Thank you all for agreeing to this meeting, Sarah began. I know that trusting a human mediator goes against your better judgment. General Korthax spoke first, his voice a low growl. We are here because our fleets are depleted, our resources exhausted, and our people dying. Not because we believe your species has any wisdom to offer. War Chief Bannon's mechanical voice added, The Iron Brotherhood has calculated that this war will continue for another 15 standard years at current attrition rates. We cannot sustain such losses indefinitely. Huntress Vexara said nothing, but her predatory gaze never left Sarah's face. You're all correct, Sarah said, surprising them. Your fleets are depleted, your resources exhausted, and your people are dying. But I want to ask you a different question. What happens when you win? The three leaders exchanged glances. It was clearly not a question they had expected. Victory will bring honor to the Empire, General Korthax replied automatically. The Iron Brotherhood will claim the ancient artifacts and unlock their technological secrets, War Chief Bannon added. Huntress Vexara spoke for the first time. The savage clans will prove that biological perfection surpasses all artificial constructs. Sarah nodded. Those are your stated objectives. But I'm asking about something else. What happens to your people when the war ends? What will give their lives meaning when they no longer have enemies to fight? A long silence filled the room. Sarah could see that her question had struck something deeper than strategic considerations. The Empire has always been at war, General Korthax said slowly. Our people are born warriors, raised warriors, die warriors. It is our nature. But was it always your nature? Sarah asked gently. Your species' historical records show that the Thraxians were originally peaceful traders. The warrior culture only developed after you encountered hostile species in your early expansion phase. Korthax's scarred face showed confusion. That was millions of years ago. We have evolved beyond those weak ancestors. Have you evolved, or have you been trapped? Sarah asked. Your entire society now depends on having enemies to fight. But what happens when you run out of enemies? Do you turn on each other? Do you create new conflicts to justify your existence? War Chief Bannon's mechanical components whirred as he processed this idea. The Brotherhood believes that strength comes from overcoming weakness. War provides the ultimate test of strength. But you've been fighting this same war for 3 years, Sarah pointed out. None of you have achieved decisive victory despite deploying your strongest forces. What if the war itself has become your weakness? What if you're all so committed to fighting that you've forgotten how to actually win? Huntress Vexara leaned forward, her enhanced senses focused entirely on Sarah. You speak as if ending the war is possible, but our grievances are real. The other species have committed unforgivable crimes against our people. I'm not questioning the reality of your grievances, Sarah replied. I'm questioning whether continuing to fight is actually serving your people's interests. Tell me, Huntress, what crime was so terrible that it justified sacrificing an entire generation of your warriors? Vexara's expression grew dark. The crystal hives destroyed our sacred breeding grounds on Kepler 7. Without those biological enhancement chambers, our evolution has stagnated. And how has 3 years of warfare brought you closer to recovering or replacing those breeding grounds? Sarah asked. The question hung in the air like an accusation. Vexara's enhanced features showed a flicker of uncertainty. Sarah continued. General Korthax, the Iron Brotherhood destroyed 17 Thraxian colonies in the opening phase of this war. How has your response brought those colonies back? It has not, Korthax admitted reluctantly, but honor demands... Honor demands what? Sarah interrupted gently. More dead soldiers? More destroyed worlds? At what point does honor become indistinguishable from stupidity? War Chief Bannon's mechanical voice carried a note of confusion. You are suggesting that we abandon our principles. I'm suggesting that you examine whether your principles are actually serving your principles, Sarah said. War Chief, the Iron Brotherhood believes in strength through overcoming weakness. But you've been locked in stalemate for 3 years. Where is the strength in that? She paused, looking at each of them in turn. What I'm proposing is that all 17 species involved in this conflict have been trapped in a cycle of reactive violence. You're not fighting for your stated objectives anymore. You're fighting because you don't know how to stop. General Korthax slammed his fist on the table. This is human manipulation. You seek to weaken our resolve. I seek to strengthen your resolve, Sarah replied calmly. But resolve directed toward achieving your actual goals, not just maintaining familiar patterns of behavior. She activated a holographic display showing casualty figures from all 17 species. Look at these numbers. Really look at them. How many of your best warriors, your brightest minds, your most promising young people have died in this conflict? What discoveries haven't been made? What art hasn't been created? What children haven't been born because your civilizations have poured everything into warfare? The three military leaders stared at the display, and Sarah could see the data having an impact. These were not callous monsters. They were leaders who had genuinely believed they were serving their people. "But if we stop fighting," Huntress Vexara said quietly, "what becomes of us? The savage clans have defined themselves through conflict for generations. Without enemies to prove ourselves against, how do we know who we are?" "That's the most important question you've asked," Sarah said. "And I believe the answer is that you discover who you could become instead of remaining trapped by who you've always been." She pulled up new displays showing the technological, artistic, and social achievements of each species before the war began. Your people are capable of extraordinary things when they're not focused on destruction. The question is whether you're willing to find out what those things might be. War Chief Bannon's mechanical form was completely still as he processed the implications. "You are proposing that we undergo fundamental psychological restructuring. I'm proposing that you free yourselves from psychological patterns that no longer serve you," Sarah corrected. "But I can't make that choice for you. Each of your species has to decide whether you want to remain prisoners of your own identity concepts or explore what else you might become." Over the next several hours, Sarah guided the three leaders through a process similar to what her colleagues were conducting with the other 14 species. She asked them to examine their deepest motivations, to confront the gap between their stated objectives and their actual behavior, and to consider what their people truly needed versus what they thought they wanted. The breakthrough came when General Korthax suddenly stopped speaking and stared at his hands. "My son died in the battle for the Nexus Station," he said quietly. "He was 18 years old, barely finished with military academy. I told myself he died for the glory of the Empire." His voice cracked. "But what glory? What has his death accomplished? The station is still contested. His sacrifice changed nothing." Huntress Vexara's predatory features softened. "Our warriors sing death songs for enemies they respect. We have been fighting the same enemies for so long that we have run out of new songs. We are killing and dying for people we no longer even see as individuals." War Chief Bannon's mechanical components whirred as he accessed deep memory files. "The Iron Brotherhood originally pursued technological enhancement to protect ourselves from a hostile universe. But we have become the hostile universe we sought to escape from." Sarah felt the familiar sensation she had experienced in countless negotiations. The moment when deep psychological barriers begin to crumble and genuine understanding becomes possible. But this time, it was happening simultaneously across 17 different species. Her communication device chimed with updates from her colleagues. Rodriguez reported breakthrough moments with the trade-focused species who had discovered that their economic disputes were actually expressions of deeper fears about scarcity and survival. Rachel was helping the religious factions recognize that their holy wars had become obstacles to the spiritual growth they claimed to seek. Elena's voice came through on a private channel. "Sarah, we're seeing unprecedented psychological synchronization across all 17 groups. It's as if the collective realization is creating resonance effects that are amplifying the individual transformations. But the most dramatic change came from an unexpected source." General Korthax stood up and activated his communication device, sending a message to his fleet commanders. All Thraxian forces. This is General Korthax. Effective immediately, you are ordered to cease all offensive operations and establish defensive positions only. Any commander who initiates aggressive action against coalition forces will be court-martialed. War Chief Bannon and Huntress Vexara stared at him in shock. "General," Vexara said carefully, "your people will see this as surrender." "My people will see this as sanity," Korthax replied. "I have spent 3 years sending children to die for objectives I can no longer even clearly articulate. That ends today." War Chief Bannon's mechanical form was processing rapidly. If the Thraxian Empire withdraws from active combat, the strategic balance changes completely. "The strategic balance was always an illusion," Korthax said. "We have all been fighting shadows while our real enemies, poverty, ignorance, isolation, meaninglessness, conquered our home worlds." Sarah watched as the 3 most militaristic leaders in the coalition wars began to coordinate a cessation of hostilities that, hours earlier, would have been inconceivable to any of them. The process continued for 6 more days. One by one, the 17 species began to recognize that their conflicts were expressions of deeper psychological needs that could be met through cooperation rather than competition. The territorial disputes were really about fear of scarcity, which could be addressed through shared resource development. The ethnic hatreds were expressions of identity insecurity, which could be healed through cultural exchange programs. The religious conflicts were about meaning and purpose, which could be found through collaborative exploration of the ancient artifacts they had been fighting over. By the end of the week, the first comprehensive peace treaty in the coalition wars had been signed. But more importantly, all 17 species had committed to ongoing psychological development programs designed to help them maintain their new perspective and continue growing beyond their old limitations. Ambassador Sarah Chen stood once again on the observation deck of the Harmony. But now, instead of battle flashes, she watched the lights of construction vessels beginning to build joint research stations and cultural exchange centers. Her communication device chimed with a priority message from Chancellor Mordex. His hologram appeared with an expression she had never seen before, something that might have been amazement. "Ambassador Chen," he began, "the Galactic Council has reviewed the results of your therapeutic diplomacy intervention. The transformation of the coalition wars from the galaxy's most intractable conflict to a model of cooperative development has exceeded all expectations." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "What is the Council's decision regarding human diplomatic involvement?" "The Council has voted unanimously to not only lift the ban on human diplomats, but to request that humanity develop a comprehensive therapeutic diplomacy training program for all member species," Mordex announced. "We have realized that the galaxy's conflicts are not political problems that happen to have psychological components. They are psychological problems that express themselves politically." He paused, his 4 arms spreading in what Sarah had learned to recognize as a gesture of deep respect. "Your species has taught us something profound. True peace requires not just ending wars, but healing the wounds that cause wars to begin." As Mordex's image faded, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. Humanity had been banned from galactic diplomacy because their methods were too psychologically disruptive. But that disruption, it turned out, was exactly what the galaxy needed, not just to solve conflicts, but to evolve beyond the need for conflict altogether. The stars beyond her viewport no longer seemed cold and distant. They represented civilizations that were finally learning to heal their deepest wounds, to grow beyond their oldest limitations, and to discover what they could become when they stopped being trapped by what they had always been. For the first time in galactic history, peace was not just the absence of war, it was the presence of genuine psychological health and continued growth. And humanity, The species whose words cut deeper than knives had become the healers of a wounded universe.